In past few sessions, we had a discussion on support vector machines. This was section 1 of unit number 5. Today, we are going to move on to section 2 of unit number 5. In this section, we are going to deal with neural networks, or more precisely artificial neural networks. So what we are going to learn in this unit, or rather in this section of this unit, we will begin with introduction to neural network, in which we are going to discuss about the human brain in brief, and how human brain or the neurons, biological neurons, inspired the researchers to come up with the concept of artificial neural networks. We are going to see the first computational model of a neuron, that is known as McCulloch-Pitts neuron, or in short MP neuron. Then we'll proceed to the simplest form of neural network known as perceptron. Then we'll talk about perceptron learning. Then we'll proceed to the multi-layer neural network, the backpropagation algorithm, and finally in this unit we are going to introduce deep neural networks. Neural networks is one of the popular areas in machine learning and pattern recognition, because it has the capability to represent and learn highly complex and non-linear functions. As the name suggests, neural network was inspired by the functioning of the human brain, or neurons in the brain. Human beings are amazingly intelligent and can do certain tasks extremely well, and this inspired the researchers to come up with neural networks as to provide the machines artificial intelligence similar to the human brain. Now let us visualize the lateral view of human brain. It has various areas. Few are meant for some kind of sensory tasks, whereas others are used for controlling the tasks. For example, here is the visual cortex. So this area is responsible for human vision. The input for this visual cortex is through the eyes. So whatever are the inputs, those are been sensed by visual cortex and then processed further through the brain. As we are not the people from biology, we are not going into the details of how the processing has been done, but only I am explaining what kind of input, or which part is sensing what kind of input, and that gets processed through the brain. Similarly, we are having the auditory cortex, for which our ears are providing the inputs, and this auditory cortex is sensing the voice, and then it has been processed by the brain. Many times it happens that many of the biological sensors are sensing the data at a time, and the brain is processing the information parallelly. Thus, we may say that brain is a highly complex, non-linear and parallel information processing system. It has the capability to organize its structural constituents known as neurons so as to perform certain computations, for example, the recognition tasks, the perception, etc. Once again, consider the example of human vision, which is an information processing task. It is the function of the visual system to provide a representation of the environment around us. Also, it should provide or supply the information that is required to interact with the environment. To be specific, the brain routinely accomplishes perceptual recognition tasks. For example, recognizing a familiar face embedded in an unfamiliar scene in approximately 100 to 200 milliseconds. So, how does a human brain do it? The answer to this question is really very complex, but let us try to answer this in simple words. At birth, a brain already has considerable structure and the ability to build up its own rules of behavior through what we usually refer to as experience. As the infant or the child comes across various faces every day or the actions, the child starts building the experience. Indeed, experience is built up over time, with much of the development of the human brain taking place during the first 2 years from the birth, but the development continues well beyond that stage. Thus, the human brain learns from this experience, and then that experience or learning is being used in the later stages. Let us see the block diagram of a nervous system. It can be viewed as a 3-stage system as depicted in the figure here. Central to the system is the brain. It is represented by the neural net in this block. This block continually receives the information, perceives the same, and makes appropriate decisions. 2 sets of arrows are shown in the figure. Those are pointing from left to right and also from right to left. The arrows pointing from left to right indicate the forward transmission of information bearing signals through the system, whereas the arrows pointing from right to left, shown in blue here in this figure, signify the presence of feedback in the system. The receptors convert stimuli from the human body or the external environment into electrical impulses that convey information to the brain or the neural net. The effectors, that is the last block in this figure, convert electrical impulses generated by the neural net into discernible responses as the system outputs. After having the overview of the nervous system, now let us go into few more details. The human brain is composed of around 100 billion nerve cells called neurons. Every neuron or the cell is connected to thousands of other neurons or cells by axons. The stimuli from external environment or inputs from sensory organs are accepted by the receptors or precisely by dendrites. These inputs create electric impulses, as I mentioned earlier, which quickly travel through the neural network. A neuron can send message to other neurons. Thus, the output from one neuron feeds into the input of another neuron through the synaptic connections. Please look at this figure. See here, the stimuli from the inputs from sensory organs are accepted by the dendrites here. Those are being processed in the neurons and sent via the axons to the other neurons. Thus, through the axon, the output is transmitted through the electric impulses through the synaptic layer to the other neurons. So see here in this figure, we are having a zoomed part, a small region wherein we can visualize the synapse. In the nervous system, a synapse is a structure that permits a neuron to pass an electrical or chemical signal to another neuron or to the target effector cell. In fact, this entire biological processing at the neuron level is what inspired the neural network architecture. Thus, to summarize, a neuron can be divided into three basic units: dendrites, cell body, or it is also called as soma, and axon. For every task we do in our brain, a specific network of neurons fire signals which pass through synaptic terminals to dendrites, through the cell body to axon, which further get transferred to another neuron. Here is one interesting illustration. Let me clear that this illustration is extremely simplified just to have an overall idea. However, as my understanding of how brain works is very limited, and this is just to have the overall representation. I do not claim that the actual processing is exactly the similar. So let us see this figure. This is one example how actually our brain takes the decision. Here we have the input as a movie. So our sensory organs interact with the outside world and send the video and audio information to the neurons. Let's say we are watching a movie having audio, video and text inputs. Now the information our brain receives is taken in by the set of neurons that will help us make a decision on, say, whether to laugh or not to laugh. Each neuron gets fired or activated only when its respective criteria is met. Actually, thousands of neurons are participating in making this decision. In fact, these huge number of neurons are structured into layers. The sensory organs pass the information to the first or the lowest layer of the neurons to process it, and the output of the neurons from the first layer is passed on to the next layers in a hierarchical manner. Some of the neurons will fire and some won't, and this process goes on until it results in the final response. In this particular example, our final response is whether to laugh or not. This massive network also ensures that there is a division of work. Each neuron only fires when its intended criteria is met. That is, a neuron may perform a certain task to a certain stimulus. Please see this figure. So few neurons activate when visual is funny, few activate when speech is funny, and few activate when text is funny. So as we are having different forms of input, we are having various neurons, those fire based on those kinds of inputs. And finally, to make it simplified, if we assume that these three neurons are working with three kinds of input data, and this fourth neuron is actually giving us the output, then we may say that if 2 out of these 3 neurons are activated, this output neuron will produce the output as laugh, otherwise no laugh. Please note, to come up with a final decision, the brain could be relying on the entire network and not on a single layer of neurons. Now, let us see how the structure of the neuron is simulated by a network or neural network unit. Let us see once again. Towards left, we have a representation of biological neuron. We have dendrites, those work as inputs, so those receives signals from other neurons. We have cell body or soma that processes the information. We have axon that transmits the output of the neuron. Also, we have axon terminals or synapse, that is a point of connection to other neurons. This biological neuron is simulated by a neural unit, and that is known as McCulloch-Pitts neuron or simply MP neuron. This is the first computational model of a neuron, and that was proposed by McCulloch, who was neurologist, and Pitts, who was a logician, in the year 1943. As you can see here in this figure, we have in this MP neuron the inputs x1, x2 up to xn. Please note here, in this model we are having the binary inputs. That means the inputs are having the value 0 or 1. So these inputs are provided to an artificial neuron. This artificial neuron is divided into two parts, function G and function F. Function G aggregates the inputs and function F takes the decision based on this aggregation, and this artificial neuron produces an output Y. The output Y is also of binary nature. So Y belongs to the set 0 and 1. So this is how the McCulloch-Pitts neuron is been represented. So let us see now how this McCulloch-Pitts neuron works. As we have seen, we are having n number of inputs to the artificial neuron. So this input x1, x2 up to xn, it is similar to that of dendrites in our biological neuron. As we mentioned, these inputs are binary. So the artificial neuron is having two parts, So this first aggregate function g actually collects those inputs, and based on this aggregation, this function f actually makes the decision. Typically, this function f might be the thresholding function. So we may have a threshold. So if g of x is greater than or equal to the threshold, then the function evaluates y as 1, otherwise 0. So we are having the output also as binary. Let us see one simple example to understand this concept. Suppose we would like to make a decision whether we should go to watch a movie or not. Now we are having several inputs to decide whether we should go for a movie or not. We may have the inputs like, is the movie thriller, is the director say X, is the actor say Y, and so on. So based on all these inputs, the neuron finds the aggregate, and this function f based on the value of g decides whether to fire a neuron or not. If neuron gets fired, that means y equal to 1. If the neuron is not fired, y is 0. As I mentioned, we are having n number of inputs. Now the inputs can be excitatory or inhibitory. So what we mean by that? Let us see what is inhibitory first. So once again, see our movie example. If we are having one input that is inhibitory, say for example, I am ill. So due to this single input, even though other inputs are allowing me to go for a movie, this input is resisting me for going out. Thus, this input is inhibitory. So, if we have any input that is inhibitory, irrespective of all other inputs, our neuron does not fire. So in our example, if I am ill, the output of my neuron is 0. So my neuron will not fire, and the decision is do not go to watch a movie. And what is excitatory input now? So as opposed to the inhibitory input, excitatory input cannot have the individual influence on the output. So it works in combination. So if the input is excitatory, this input combines with all other inputs, and then only the neuron will decide whether to fire or not. So we have formulated these conditions. Please look at this slide. Y equal to 0 if any xi is inhibitory, so the neuron will not fire. If any xi is inhibitory, else compute g of x, that is a function of all the inputs x1, x2 up to xn, and which is given as summation over I equal to 1 to n xi. So I am summing up all the inputs, and f is the function of g of x. So y is equal to the function of g of x, and it is equal to 1 if g of x is greater than or equal to theta. It is equal to 0 if g of x is less than theta. Here theta is the thresholding parameter, and this is called as the thresholding logic. So if we once again look at our movie example, we are having various inputs, binary inputs, and we may have a threshold, like say for example I am having 3 inputs, say the kind of movie, the actor and the director. So it may happen sometimes that if 2 of the inputs are 1, then this summation would be 2, and hence if I am having set the threshold 2, that means if 2 of my likings are matched, then the neuron is fired and I can go for watching the movie. But if out of these 3 only one input matches or it is 1, then the neuron will not fire and the decision is do not go for movie. But if I am very keen about my choice, then I should have the higher threshold, say for example 3, then I want all the inputs to be matched with my choices. So all the inputs should be 1, and then only the decision of the neuron will be 1 and I can go for watching a movie. I hope you must have understood the concept of MP neuron and how it works. As MP neuron is designed to learn Boolean inputs producing Boolean outputs, lots of decision problems we can cast in this simple framework. Let us try to implement few Boolean functions. So let us once again see our MP neuron model with 3 inputs. See here x1, x2, x3 are the inputs, and we have a threshold theta. The neuron finds the sum of the inputs. If this sum crosses the threshold theta, the neuron will fire, otherwise it will not fire. So let us try to learn now the Boolean function AND. So when it will be fired, we want all the inputs to be 1 to have the output as 1. That means if all the inputs are on, then only the neuron will be fired. So what would be the threshold now? So for AND function, the threshold would be 3. Similarly, if we look at the OR function and if we try to learn the OR function, here we want any one of the inputs to be on, and hence the threshold would be 1. Now let us try to learn this function, Boolean function, say x1 and not x2. Here we have an inhibitory input, that is x2. So it is denoted with this circle at the end of this input x2. In general scenario, what we mean by inhibitory input? The output is 0 if this inhibitory input is 1. In this example, we have the inhibitory input, that is x2, and we are trying to learn x1 and not x2. So whenever x2 is 1, here the output will be 0. Thus x1 and not x2 would output 1 only when x1 is 1 and x2 is 0. So it is obvious that the threshold parameter should be 1. Let us try to verify that g of x, that is x1 plus x2, is greater than or equal to 1 in 3 cases. Case 1, when x1 is 1 and x2 is 0. Case 2, when x1 is 1 and x2 is 1. And case 3, when x1 is 0 and x2 is 1. But as x2 is inhibitory input, in case 2 and case 3, the output will be 0 because x2 is 1. And x1 and not x2 would output 1 for only the case 1. So our thresholding parameter holds good for the given function. Similarly, we can learn the NOR function. For a NOR neuron to fire, we want all the inputs to be 0. So the thresholding parameter should also be 0, and we have to take them as the inhibitory inputs. And finally, let us see NOT function. For a NOT neuron, 1 outputs 0 and 0 outputs 1. So we take the input as an inhibitory input and set the thresholding parameter to 0. Now let us look at the geometric interpretation of MP neuron. To understand the concept, let us try to have geometric interpretation for the Boolean function OR. For simplicity, let us consider the OR function with 2 inputs x1 and x2. x1 and x2 are the Boolean inputs. As we have already discussed, OR function's thresholding parameter theta is 1. As the inputs are Boolean, we are having only 4 combinations possible: 0 0, 0 1, 1 0 and 1 1 for x1 and x2 respectively. Now plotting them on a 2-dimensional graph and making use of OR function's aggregate equation, we can have the decision boundary denoted here as x1 plus x2 equal to 1. So our thresholding function says that if x1 plus x2 is greater than or equal to 1, the neuron gets fired, otherwise it will not fire. So this is the OR function. So the decision boundary is represented as x1 plus x2 equal to theta, and theta is 1. Please remember, we are plotting this only using the Boolean points and we are not having any kind of real number interpretation in this plot. So using this graphical interpretation, we may say that all those inputs whose output is 1 when passed through the OR function MP neuron lie on or above the decision boundary, and all the input points that lie below the boundary are going to output 0. Thus, MP neuron is able to conveniently represent the Boolean functions which are linearly separable. We worked with OR function. Similarly, you may try the remaining Boolean functions with such kind of geometric interpretation. So this is your homework. You work with remaining Boolean functions to come up with its geometric interpretation. Now let us talk about the limitations of MP neuron. So we are posing few questions here. Question number 1, what about non-Boolean, say real inputs? Question 2, do we always need to hand code the threshold? Question number 3, are all inputs equal? What if we want to assign more importance to some of the inputs? And question number 4, what about the functions which are not linearly separable? Say for example, the function like XOR function. So it is clear from our discussion related to MP neuron that it is not possible to address these 4 questions, and this is the reason why we are not using the MP neuron today, because it is having these kinds of limitations. So overcoming the limitations of MP neuron, an American psychologist, Frank Rosenblatt, proposed the concept of perceptron in 1958. It is more generalized computational model than the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, where weights and thresholds can be learnt over time. In the next session, we are going to focus upon these perceptrons and their learning rule. So, let us stop today. I hope you might have found this neural networks very interesting, as it has inspired from the biological neurons. So let us stop today and we'll continue in the next session. Thank you.